Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to our second topic for this week in American History 2. Today we're going to wrap things up. We're looking at some of the interwar period in American history and focus on the Great Depression, when some of the good times of the 1920s officially came to an end. As always, we'll start off looking at key terms. As you might have noticed, a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today is economic. So, for example, if you're interested in economic history for your final essay, make sure you pay good attention today. Now, we're going to be looking at things called stocks. Naturally, we'll look at the New York Stock Exchange itself. We'll look at the infamous Black Tuesday event, and we'll also look at bank runs. Finally, we should wrap things up discussing the Dust Bowl. So again, a lot of economic and some agricultural issues today. In the meantime, of course, your deadlines. Essentially, they're exactly the same, or literally the same as what I showed you earlier this week if you've already viewed topic 1. Content quiz is coming up, midterms coming up, and your second debate is coming up. I won't repeat anything that I said in the last one for the most part, just in the interest of time. But once again, just remember that for these major assignments, the prompts and the rubrics are already in Moodle, so you can look at them and start preparing for them at literally any time you feel the need to. I'd recommend doing it as soon as possible, of course. Now, let's go ahead and jump right into it and look at some of the major causes of the infamous Great Depression. First, we're going to look at the stock market. A stock market, in case you didn't know, which actually do exist in several countries and several places, even in America, by the way. There's not just one stock market. But anyway, this is a place where buyers and sellers come together to trade stocks. Now, you might be asking what a stock is, of course. A stock is essentially a byproduct of some of the increase of capitalism and corporations that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. A stock is essentially just a share of investment in a company or a corporation that can be bought. So, for example, let's say you pay $1,000, you might buy just like a 1% or a lesser than 1% investment in some company or corporation. The way it works is if the corporation profits, the stockholders profit. Makes sense. Everyone gets a little bit of profit, otherwise no one will participate in this. So, for example, let's say our entire class was going to invest some money in Microsoft, for example. Pretty safe bet. If Microsoft profits, then our stock value will increase. We get a little bit of money in return for our investment. However, if the corporation loses money, the stockholders will then lose their investment and not get any return. That's why a lot of people essentially refer to the stock market as gambling. If the corporation wins, you can win pretty big. However, unfortunately, as you can probably guess from the topic of today, if the corporation goes under, the stockholders are going to be in a pretty bad place. Now, during the Roaring Twenties, a little bit of what we talked about last week that I left out a bit, many people during this time period did invest huge amounts of money, in some cases even their entire life savings, into buying these stocks. Most of the stock trading, of course, was done at the infamous New York Stock Exchange, which you can see pictured here. Now, why would people be willing to do this and invest so much money? Imaginary class viewing this in the future. But yeah, it's right there in the name, as you might have guessed, with the Roaring Twenties. After World War I, things seemed to be going pretty well for America, and a lot of people were very prosperous. Many people assumed, as they often did in sort of the old economic thinking that was popular in America, that capitalism was so great that it would just continuously improve and the economy would just boom and grow forever. However, obviously, as we're going to see throughout this class today, that was not necessarily the case. So again, what stock trading can be a very risky business. For example, I did actually want to throw in a personal example without naming any names. An old high school friend of mine once asked me to invest money in his used jewelry business. He was going to get used jewelry. He never said how, naturally, and sell it to people. So, obviously, if I invested in that, I'm probably never going to see my money again. This is basically a very basic example of what many of these stockholders would go through. If you invest all your money in a failed business, all your money is gone and you can never get it back. Now, other problems made this worse and made the eventual stock crash worse than it might have been otherwise. For example, we already talked a little bit about the reliance of credit or the over-reliance on credit in the American economy just a bit with sharecropping. Remember, when talking about sharecropping, why is this such a bad thing? Like, why is this such a problem if you're over-relied on credit? Give you a bit of a hint for those of you who maybe have your own credit cards or know people who do at this point already. What happens when you don't pay your credit card bill? Exactly, very good imaginary class. It's the same thing that happened to African Americans under sharecropping. With all these people buying things on credit, the bills would eventually come due, and a lot of times they couldn't be paid off because, again, everyone just assumed that this economy was just going to keep surging forward. When it didn't, they couldn't pay the credit card bills. This is actually made worse as well by the growing number or the growing intensity of national advertising campaigns. The campaigns like this, for example, for cars were very common. Remember for the last class when I talked about how so many millions of cars were being produced throughout the 1920s. Many people got suckered into this consumerism that was growing in America because of ads like this. They would buy things on credit with money they didn't actually have, and eventually had bills that they couldn't pay. Unequal wage distribution was also a major problem as well between the corporations and the workers. Now remember from when we talked about with the Gilded Age, why was wage distribution like this allowed? Why did it actually exist? I'll just sit here awkwardly while I wait for an answer. But yes, very good future class. Remember how the federal government and state governments intervened in these disputes. They, up to this point, and not really only until the later portions of the class we're going to talk about, they would always take the corporation's side because they were seen as a necessary part of the nation's economy. So wage distribution was very equal and workers had very limited rights because the government never took their side. This meant once the economy soured, these poor workers and everyday Americans were hit even harder than they would have been otherwise. Lastly, there was a lack of regulation on banking practices. Specifically, there was no limit on what a person could borrow or get a loan from the bank. Now, why would this in particular be such an issue? Think about how banks work if you're familiar with banking. All right, again, very good banking expert I might have randomly had in here. This is essentially such a huge problem because remember, it's not just, you don't just put one person's bank or one person's money in one single bank. All the people's money around the area is all going to be pooled in the same bank. So let's say, for example, I was just a dumb rich person who saw this advertisement for a car. I decided I wanted to buy it. I went to the bank and got a huge loan, more money than I even had in my account potentially. To get that money to pay me, they're going to have to drain other people's accounts as well. The idea is, again, that this economy is just going to keep surging and keep growing, and they'll make back the money to pay the other people or to fill other people's accounts. However, if the banks crash and the economy goes sour, that loan I take out for this car may never be paid back to the bank, and therefore other people's bank accounts are going to be emptied as well. So essentially it's just a horrible cycle. Someone takes out a loan, the bank can't make up the money, and people's accounts keep getting drained because the bank is putting no regulations on how much money people can take out. This helped directly lead to Black Tuesday, which, as I mentioned, was one of the most infamous days in American history. By October of that year, of 1929, a huge amount of stocks have been purchased that didn't match projected national earnings. Now, again, for any of you who may have stocks already, why is it such a bad idea to buy stocks when it doesn't look like there's going to be any projected earnings? Alright, very good. That one's probably pretty obvious, imaginary class. It goes back again to the idea of how the stock market works. If a corporation loses money, all the stockholders are going to lose money as well. So therefore, you basically have all these stocks that are being bought that aren't going to make you any of a profit, and you're actually going to lose all of your investment. So essentially, these corporations are not only going to decline, but all the average Joes and all the rich people even in the country who bought stocks in these companies, they're going to lose huge amounts of profit as well. This directly led to October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. Seeing how worthless all these stocks were, 16 million worthless stocks were traded and sold in just one day. Because of this, people started to realize that all these stocks were worthless. The overall stock value plummeted across the entire country. So essentially, people aren't buying stocks anymore, and the stocks that are being traded and sold are worthless and won't net anyone any profit. Overall, consumers lost confidence in the stock market, and investment across the board in corporations and business dropped quite sharply. Why is that going to be such a problem? Imaginary class. But yes, very good. Money's basically draining all across the board, essentially. Since people are no longer are buying stocks or investing any money in these corporations, many of them didn't have the money to operate, pay employees. There are massive layoffs and increased unemployment, and essentially investment in the entire American economy is just going down. So there's no money to accomplish really anything. This led as well to the increase of bank runs across America. Most community consumers, since again, as I mentioned, due to all these loans, they were just handing out people's money willy-nilly. Can't believe I just used that term. I feel like a grandpa. But anyway, this caused many people to lose confidence in banks. This led to some of the infamous banking runs throughout American history. These were the bank runs were where massive amounts of investors demanded to withdraw their deposits from a bank in mass numbers. As you can see in this picture here, sometimes they could stretch back entire blocks with everyone trying to withdraw their money at once. There were a series of yearly waves across America from about 1930 to 1933. Now again, the lack of banking regulations made this worse. Why? Those of you who are paying attention. Yeah, that should be pretty simple if you were paying attention just a couple of minutes ago. Since there were no regulations on how much people could draw out for a loan, many people never got the opportunity to withdraw their deposits in the first place. Especially average citizens, they would of course have smaller bank accounts than many rich people. Their entire savings could be wiped out just by one single loan when the economy was doing well. So essentially, the bank now has no money because everyone who can is withdrawing their savings, and many people have just lost their savings account completely, and because of the lack of regulations, they have no way to recover it. Before I move on, I almost forgot. These bank runs and loss of confidence in banks actually affected many of your older relatives more than you might think. Now, does anybody know if you may be seeing or hearing a story of some weird places where your grandparents may have hidden money? All right, hopefully some of you have thought of a few examples. I've heard examples of people burying their money in safes in the yard. A few students I've seen in the past frequently would mention hiding things in refrigerators, things of that nature. One student mentioned that their grandparents hid all their money in the freezer, things like that. My grandparents, not to get too personal and give out their personal details, but they hid their money in mattresses, actually. One of the most classic, stereotypical examples of hiding money. But this just shows how much the bank runs and the stock market crash hurt people's confidence in that generation of banks. My grandparents hardly ever used banks again for the rest of their lives. Many other people's grandparents that I know were exactly the same. After this, bank obviously, as we'll get into next week, bank confidence did go back up eventually, but for many years still, many people would never properly invest in a bank again, which led to many of the modern banking regulations we're going to talk about next week. In the meantime, the economy also soured during this time period because of something called the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl occurred at a horrible time, basically. This was an ecological and economic tragedy that lasted for most of the 1930s. So essentially, when the economy has already crashed in 1929, it's made worse by the Dust Bowl. Throughout the 1910s and the 1920s, farmers had cultivated very arid lands in the Great Plains region that couldn't be properly irrigated. Now, what exactly is irrigation? Any farmers I might have in here? All right, yes, very good. Farmer that I'm assuming still exists, or at least knows a farmer. Irrigation is where you get water or bring in water from rivers, lakes, anything like that, to provide your crops just with water that they need to survive naturally. If you know anything about the Great Plains, you know that's a very open, dry, arid place. not a lot of access to fresh water. So, since they couldn't get much water to this area, it was very difficult to keep these crops healthy. Finally, by 1931, there was a massive drought that occurred across the nation, exposed these overused soil, because as you might also be aware, they were just frequently farming the same thing over and over. There was a lack of prairie grass that allowed all this dust to eventually be blown away. Now, you might be asking why they would so heavily farm these areas that would seem pretty useless. That is actually mainly due to the rising wheat prices that occurred during the 1910s and the 1920s. When the economy was booming, there was a huge market for selling wheat. So farmers would just get as much acres as they could, grow as much wheat as they could as fast as they could, which led again to this soil being overused. By 1934, about 35 million acres had actually been rendered useless for farming. Now, before we talk a little bit more about the impact of the Dust Bowl upon American life, I do just want to focus a little bit on an interesting tidbit from American history. During the Great Depression, and especially during the Dust Bowl, many historians have argued that a national belief in postmillennialism grew across the Midwest. Now, some of you, especially who have Protestant or religious backgrounds, are probably aware with postmillennialism or premillennialism belief. But for anyone who's not, postmillennialism is the belief that Christ is going to return to earth after the Great Tribulation, which is a time of suffering and rule by the Antichrist, and he would also return after there had been a millennium of Christ's teachings dominating the earth. So essentially they believed that before Christ would return, the Great Tribulation and a time of suffering could occur at any moment. Now, why do you think the Dust Bowl would make this belief more popular? I lose my voice doing this all day. But yeah, eventually just to get you an idea, take a look at one of these pictures right here. Or even just look at this picture I shared earlier. The Dust Bowl was a huge ecological disaster. Humongous dust storms would sweep across the nation. It made many people believe that they could genuinely be entering the end times. So again, they figured, many people started to believe that maybe we were in this period of suffering, but it gave them hope that there could be some sort of rescue from it, and that potentially Christ could actually return. So again, just a bit of an interesting tidbit on how how events in American history can influence its religious makeup. Before this, postmillennialism wasn't as popular as premillennialism in a lot of Protestant denominations especially. However, it is argued that postmillennialism owes a lot of its current popularity to the Dust Bowl. In the meantime, just a few wide-ranging examples of how the Great Depression and Dust Bowl affected the world, or affected America specifically. Unemployment rose to a rate of about 25%. There were massive bread lines just to get access to food. There were infamous hobo camps, which were also known as Hoover camps, which, you can see depicted right here. Now, for those of you who know who Hoover is, how popular do you think the government was at this time? Yeah, the short answer is not very. Many people blamed J. Edgar Hoover, the president at the time, for these hobo camps, so they would be sarcastically nicknamed Hoover camps. We'll talk a little bit next week about how Hoover had to deal with that. 9,000 banks failed or closed across the United States. Farm product also value declined in half because all these farms were failing. Finally, the suicide rate itself actually did raise quite a bit during this time period. Before the start of the Great Depression, the average suicide rate was about 17 per 100,000 citizens. By 1929, it had jumped up to by 1932, it had jumped to about 21.3 per 100,000 suicides. So the stock market essentially had such a wide-ranging effect that it literally raised the number of suicides in this country. Very depressing place to start, obviously, but that's where I'm going to leave you. Start thinking about and looking ahead a little bit, if you have time, to how America would eventually get out of this Great Depression. But in the meantime, you of course have these assignments coming up. Let me know if you have any questions about them, and I will see you all next week. Thank you.